The informal ceasefire proposal channeled to the Kremlin through businessman Steven Witkoff was met with a formal and unyielding response from Moscow, effectively extinguishing the flickers of hope for a swift, negotiated end to the war in Ukraine. In a televised address from the Kremlin, Russian President Vladimir Putin laid out his government's vision for peace, a vision that appeared less like a basis for negotiation and more like a list of demands for Kyiv and its Western backers to accept. President Putin, speaking in a calm but resolute tone, acknowledged the receipt of various signals and proposals from different quarters, a clear, if indirect, reference to the Witkoff initiative. However, he swiftly pivoted to Russia's long-held positions, making it clear that any cessations of hostilities would only be possible if the new territorial realities were recognized. This core demand, a non-negotiable starting point for Moscow, insists upon international legal recognition of Russia's sovereignty over Crimea and the other Ukrainian territories currently under its military control. Putin stated that the people in these regions had made their choice to be part of the Russian Federation, a claim rejected by Ukraine and the vast majority of the international community, and that this choice was final and not subject to discussion. He framed the conflict not as an act of Russian aggression, but as a necessary response to years of Western encroachment on Russia's security interests and the persecution of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Beyond the territorial demands, President Putin reiterated the necessity of Ukraine's permanent neutrality. He stipulated that Ukraine must amend its constitution to foreclose any possibility of joining military alliance such as NATO. This, he argued, was a foundational security guarantee for Russia, which could not tolerate the presence of a hostile military bloc on its border. The demilitarization of Ukraine was another key condition. While the specifics were left vague, Putin's language suggested a severe limitation on the size and capabilities of Ukraine's future armed force, likely restricting them to a level sufficient only for internal security, not national defense against an external aggressor. Furthermore, he demanded what he termed the denazification of Ukraine, a broad and ill-defined goal that Moscow has used since the start of the war to justify its action. This demand includes the removal of Ukraine's current political leadership, which the Kremlin baselessly portrays as a neo-Nazi regime, and the prohibition of certain nationalist ideologies. He concluded his address by stating that if Kyiv and its overseas masters were not ready to accept these reasonable and fair conditions, then the Russian military would continue its mission until all of its goals were achieved, placing the onus for continued bloodshed squarely on Ukraine and the West. The message was unambiguous. Russia would not be swayed by economic incentives or back-channel overture. It would negotiate only from a position of strength and on its own terms. The starkness of Putin's position sent immediate shockwaves through the Trump administration, forcing a rapid reassessment of the Witkoff gambit. In Washington, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was tasked with the delicate job of diplomatic damage control. Secretary Rubio's office immediately initiated calls with the Ukrainian government and key European allies. His primary message was one of steadfastness, reassuring them that the United States would not entertain any proposal that compromised Ukraine's sovereignty or territorial integrity. Speaking to the press, Secretary Rubio emphasized that while President Trump was committed to finding a path to peace, it would not be peace at any price. He stressed that Putin's demands were non-starters and fundamentally incompatible with the principle of international law and the United Nations Charter. Privately, Secretary Rubio and his team at the State Department analyzed Putin's speech as a classic Russian negotiating tactic, an extreme opening position designed to test the resolve of the Western alliance and to frame any future minor concession as a major act of goodwill. However, they also could not discount the possibility that Putin was entirely serious, prepared to wage a long war of attrition until he achieved his maximalist objective. Secretary Rubio's strategy moving forward involves strengthening the diplomatic coalition against Russia, pushing for even greater European military support for Ukraine and ensuring that any future diplomatic engagement with Moscow happens through officials, coordinated channels with Ukraine at the table. From the Pentagon, the view was equally grim. Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth interpreted Putin's firm stance as a direct challenge to American and Western military resolve. In a classified briefing to President Trump and the National Security Council, Secretary Hegseth argued that Putin's confidence stemmed from Russia's current advantage on the battlefield, including its superiority in manpower and artillery. He contended that Putin's speech was a signal that Russia believes it is winning the war and therefore feels no pressure to negotiate seriously. Secretary Hegseth strongly advised against any reduction in military aid to Ukraine, arguing that now more than ever was the time to increase the flow of advanced weaponry to Kyiv. His recommendation was to provide Ukraine with the tools it needs to inflict significant costs on the Russian military, thereby altering Putin's strategic calculus and creating conditions more favorable for future negotiation. The Secretary of Defense argued that demonstrating weakness or wavering of support in the face of Putin's intransigence would only embolden the Kremlin and invite further aggressions. He instructed his planners to accelerate the delivery of long-range missiles, air defense systems, and armored vehicles to Ukraine, in the military front as the most effective arena to counter Putin's diplomatic stonewalling. The intelligence community, under the leadership of Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, provided a more nuanced, though no less sobering, analysis. Director Gabbard's assessment presented to the president suggested that Putin's hardline position was driven by a combination of factors. Domestically, she noted, the firm stance plays well with the nationalist base in Russia, reinforcing the narrative of a strong leader standing up to a hostile West. The Russian public, fed a steady diet of state propaganda, largely supports the Kremlin's version of events, and Putin's tough rhetoric helped solidify his grip on power. On the international stage, Director Gabbard's analysis indicated that Putin is likely attempting to exploit perceived division within the Western alliance. He is betting that the economic cost of the war and the strain of supporting Ukraine will eventually lead to Ukraine fatigue, causing some European nations to pressure Kyiv into accepting a peace deal on Russia's terms. Director Gabbard cautioned against viewing Putin's statement as a complete rejection of diplomacy. Instead, she suggested it was a clear articulation of his desired end state, a maximalist goal he will pursue relentlessly through both military and diplomatic means. He advised the administrations to prepare for a long, drawn-out struggle and to be wary of Russians' attempts to use sham negotiations as a tool to achieve a strategic pause in the fighting. The economic implications of Putin's defiant stance were immediately apparent to Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent. The Witkoff proposal's core idea of trading sanctions relief for peace was effectively dead on arrival. Putin's speech signaled that Russia is prepared to endure continued economic isolations to achieve its geopolitical aims. In response, Secretary Bessent began working on a new phase of economic warfare. His department started to explore options for tightening the existing sanctions regime, closing loopholes that have allowed Russia to acquire sensitive technology, and cracking down on the shadow fleet of oil tankers that helped Moscow evade price cap. Secretary Bessent also accelerated discussions with G7 partners about the legality and logistic of seizing the roughly $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank asset and transferring them to Ukraine for reconstruction. He argued that if Russia was unwilling to negotiate in good faith, the West should use every economic tools at its disposal to make the cost of its aggression unsustainable. The Secretary's new approach shifted from using sanctions as a bargaining chip to using them as a weapon to permanently degrade Russia's ability to wage war. For Attorney General Pam Bondi, Putin's demand for the recognition of annexed territories and a change in Kyiv's government were a direct assault on the international legal order. Her office released a statement condemning the Russian position as a flagrant violation of the principle of sovereignty and self-determination. Attorney General Bondi's primary concern was that any peace deal based on Putin's term would implicitly grant amnesty for the countless war crimes and crime against humanity allegedly committed by Russian force. He reaffirmed the United States' commitment to supporting the International Criminal Court's investigation and pledged American assistance for Ukraine's own domestic war crime tribunals. He advised President Trump that accepting any part of Putin's framework would not only betray the Ukrainian people, but would also set a catastrophic precedent, signaling to authoritarian regimes around the world that redrawing borders by force and committing mass atrocities could be normalized through military victory. He advocated for the creation of a special international tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression itself, targeting the highest level of Russia, political and military leadership. The ripple effect of Putin's statement was felt across the entire administration. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick informed American business leaders that any hopes for near-term resumptions of trade with Russia were now unrealistic. He urged them to divest from any remaining Russian assets and to focus on the long-term opportunities that would arise from the reconstructions of a free and sovereign Ukraine. At the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Kristi Noem raised the threat level for Russian cyber attack, anticipating that the Kremlin might lash out in the digital realm in response to the West's rejection of its ultimatum. He warns that critical infrastructure, financial institutions, and government networks were all potential targets. United States Representative Jameson Greer began working with European counterparts to coordinate a new round of trade restriction against Russia, focusing on goods that could support its military-industrial complex. Administrator of the Small Business Administration, Kelly Loeffler, pivoted her agency's focus from potential Russian markets to helping small American companies navigate the supply chain discussion. Administrator of the Small Business Administration, Kelly Loeffler, pivoted her agency's focus from potential Russian markets to helping small American companies navigate the supply chain disruption caused by the prolonged conflict. The entire apparatus of the U.S. government was forced to recalibrate, shifting from the tentative optimism of a potential diplomatic opening to the grim reality of a long and difficult confrontation. Putin's firm, unyielding stance had made it clear that the path to peace would not run through quite back channel or clever business deal, but would have to be forged through sustained pressure and unwavering support for Ukraine's fight for its own existence. Many of my listeners, like 70%, haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, and so many of you don't even know that you haven't subscribed, and that is actually what makes the show going. It's almost like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask again and again, because it enables us to grow and grow and grow. And we're going for the long haul here. And listen, if this is your first time listening to World Global Conflict, you don't have to subscribe. You guys, your first one's on me. But if you have watched this show before, it's like you are a freeloader now. So all I would ask you is, if you have seen this show before and you like it, help me, help my team here. Hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build this show for you. That I swear. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's all for me for today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.